respected guests from Turkey and participants from various parts of Africa, I think also from Mauritius, and our respected Shaykh and our leaders and our elders, men and women. Okay, it gives me great pleasure to be the first moderator of this conference. I was involved in the one in Johannesburg and also the one in Durban. So alhamdulillah, we've been moving around. Now, I just looked at the CVs of the people who are presenting this morning, and I was pretty overwhelmed. And I just thought if I knew these people, the qualifications, occupations, I might have refused to be the MC, to be the moderator this morning, because they're pretty overwhelming. And I just picked up from the CVs a few very, very important points. So I'm going to mention that before I ask the presenters to present their papers. The first one is I'm looking at the educational qualifications, and really I was quite bamboozled to see that our panelists here have really, done so well with PhDs and so on. It's absolutely very, something very welcoming, alhamdulillah. The second one, look at the occupations. Again, to see people in such important positions, I think it's something that we need to be very happy and proud about. The third one is also leadership. I say some of them are involved in leadership. This is what we really need in this country. I think Ram Rasool has mentioned about leadership, and I think in many aspects we lack leadership, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much of disunity among Muslims in South Africa. We lack strong leadership. Then we also have a global reach. We see some of our academics and others, professionals, who have a global reach. So they've been to universities in the US, UK, and elsewhere to teach and do research, and also some with media like Al Jazeera and so on. So we have a global, so we are known globally. Some of us actually are known globally. Also, they're involved in very relevant issues in South Africa. For instance, issues of gender-based violence, disabilities and so on. These are very important issues, and to see Muslims being involved in that, I think that's very, very pleasing. Then, of course, Black Muslim empowerment. That's right now for the last few years. We had the Black Muslim conference and so on. So this again is very, very significant. I think it's a turning point in the history of South Africa, where we see our Black Muslims now taking up the cudgels and planning and strategizing and so on. And I think really this is something which should have happened a long time ago, but alhamdulillah, the initiative has been taken and the caravan is now moving. Then I also think about the Africa focus. Again, very important. We're living in the continent of Africa. We're not living in Europe. And Africa has tremendous potential. Unfortunately, of course, many factors prevent us from reaching our potential. But even in South Africa, we have the same problem. But to see Africa focus, very important. I think that's the future. If we can just get our act together, inshallah, we will be providing leadership for the world, inshallah. Okay, each speaker has 15 minutes, okay? So I will give the bio for 2 minutes. The bios are so long, if I have to read out a biography, the 15 minutes will be up. So I'll just take, inshallah, 2 minutes for the bio. They will speak for 15 minutes, but after 13 minutes, there will be a warning. Look in front, 2 minutes to go. And after the 2 minutes, it'll say time up. And then I will cut you off. You can be very upset with me, it's okay. I don't mind. All right, so after 15 minutes, you need to sit down. And hopefully, we need to get to about 75 minutes, if we keep the time. So So that'll leave us with 15 minutes for question and answer. I repeat, question and answer, no speech. If you start a speech, we cut you off. So either you make a short comment or you ask a question. So inshallah, we'll have 15 minutes for that. Okay, so I'm going to go now to the panelists. And the first one is Shaykh Zaid Langa. Yeah. Okay, this is Shaykh Zaid Langa. I call him Shaykh because he also studied at Darul Ulum in Zakaria. As you know, Zakaria is quite a bit in the news these days. I'm not sure for good reasons or not, but it's in the news. And of course, he's also a lawyer. He did a LLB. He's an educator. He's got a master's degree and so on. And I think the most frightening thing about him is that he's working for the Department of Defense. So maybe we should be quite secure right now. Now, Sheikh Zaid, he studied at Darul Ulum Zakaria, that's based in Indonesia. As you know, he studied in Sudan as well. He studied at IPSA here in Cape Town. So I think Cape Town knows him very well. And under a number of prominent Shaykh in Cape Town, I don't want to mention names, we don't have time for that. And at UNISA, they did an LLB and also an MA in Islamic Studies. And of course, also some course, I think they're honors in education, management, and leadership. That's why I mentioned about leadership. He's a very capable leader of the community, alhamdulillah. Now he's the Amir of the Gauteng Shura Council, another very important development. Because all these years we had Indian, Malay ulama, actually in charge of the theological bodies, ulama bodies. Now we have our indigenous Muslim Gauteng Shura Council, alhamdulillah, another very important development. He's also the president of the Muhammad VI Foundation of African Ulama and director of Language Services Unit. He also was a deputy principal for a while and he's now, as I say, in the Department of Defense.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره وبالتاريخ العظيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, all praises are due to Allah, the nourisher and the sustainer of this universe. I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship besides He, and I bear witness that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final of all the divine emissaries. I think Assalamu alaikum to everybody first. Mine is just a simple but a very big task that I have to try and compress it so that it can be able to take out and make sense out of it. But it's a very vast and a very big topic that is ongoing, that hasn't really been explored very much. But alhamdulillah, efforts are coming slowly but surely, trying to explore. That is the coming of Islam in various townships and in the rural areas. Just to go a brief, I think the first one, it is to trace the coming of Islam into selected townships. These are the objectives. Highlight certain individuals who play a role in the development of Islam, list organization, movements, and missionaries who are associated with the township Islam, and analyze the social issues that affect the growth and the development of Islam in such areas. Okay, the background, we have to explain the concept of a township first so that we all understand. Because I believe that in South Africa we have a unique definition of the term township, where it only refers to a place that is inhabited by a certain race, as propounded in Group Areas Act, that demarcated areas based on race and both in industrial and residential areas. But I mean, elsewhere, township will mean the place probably will have a different meaning, but in South Africa, it has the racial connotation as it is. And therefore, our topic here will be based on that understanding of a township, which are areas that are only inhabited by your local indigenous people and also in the rural areas. To go back and understand the background of Islam in the township, of course, we have to understand the background of Islam in South Africa first. And in my way, I just summed it up in 3 different stages. The first one is that Islam during the pre-colonial period, it's an unknown era basically, even though there have been researches that have been written that shows that there was Islam before the coming of the colonizers in South Africa, but at the end of the day, it's unknown in a way that you cannot put individuals. We don't know who were these people, how were they, how they practiced their Islam, how did it, okay, some it's mentioned that through the Arab traders who passed through the Cape of Good Hope, but it's still a dark kind of a period that we are unable to really pick up the individuals. That's the first part. The second part is Islam during the colonial period, which I refer to it as a forming phase, where the Dutch and all the knowledge which I'm sure most of us are aware brought various shuyukh from Malaya or Indonesia and in the East, in UKZN, which was the real foundation and the forming phase of Islam. I mean, when you find the Awal Mosque was starting to be built, the Quran was written out of the memory. So we find this was a phase in which Islam was starting to come and be built. We were able to identify the individuals that were involved in doing that. We were able to explain and identify those people. And then the third one would be Islam during the pre and post-apartheid, after the formation of South African Union and also after the post-apartheid. Now, when we speak about Islam basically in the township, we talk about it in between the last 2 stages, especially toward the last one, because the Group Areas Act came around 1950. So we're going to be really looking and zooming in within that period, understand? And if we have to do that, I think just wanted to go back. Can you just go back? No. Yeah, okay. Right. So we find that this, between the end of the forming phase and the formalization phase. So when in one of the journals, Michael Mumisa speaks, he speaks of the Zanzibari people who came in the east coast of KZN. That's when we see that the spread of Islam in the township, that's when it started. Because we find that many of those people who came, they married local ladies. Yet we are unable to trace and identify who were the first one, but one of the things that we know is that many of them married to the Zulu women, and this is where we find that there was a first coming of Islam. I think one of the families who managed to track it migrated right through up to UKZN. They even changed their surname to a Zulu, they became Gomez Zulu, but originally they were amongst the Zanzibaris. Some of them, I managed to trace them right up to Soweto, by the way, which we'll explain later as we go in. Also, we have the Dawa activities of Sheikh Dawood Piri in the 1940s in the area of Inanda. Some, they say there were over about 200 to 300 Muslim families that were there at that particular time, which he made through his effort. And also, we're looking at the establishment of formal Dawa in the Cape. I think Zaid Ibrahim speaks about this. He spoke about Maulana Abdul Alim Siddiq, who came in the 1950s and instituted the movement and the formalization of spreading Dawa, which led, of course, to many certain individuals in the Western Cape becoming Muslim. The first one being Idris Ten, who was the first to recorded Muslim with many historians to accept Islam. But of course, he didn't really spread it much, he kept it up to himself. But also we see the first person was Imam Shamin Kula, was based in Langa East. As well, it's been recorded about him that he had over 250 Muslim. I mean, at one stage you'd be surprised that the areas of Langa East was a buzzing Muslim community. This is where all the Imam Dawood Lobi and all this got Islam from. And then it moved into the Langa Township and this thing. He also had a very big Muslim community and is well known by everybody in Western Cape. When we look in Gauteng, in Soweto, we found that Islam came in Soweto as soon as the township was established. Because the first area, I think, in Soweto that was established, it was Kliptown. And then from there, we had to Dobsonville and all these things. But we find that the Muslims are the ones who moved there. Though some of them were of Malay origin, the Indian origin, and we find also there were some Malawian and Mozambicans who were there. When we check in Soweto, we find that there was Sheikh Mustafa Muhammad, who was the Imam in one of the mosques. I think at that time it was called Sofata. He left, he moved into Soweto with his family. When we interviewed his daughter, was about 75, 76 years old. These were the first Muslim families that he had. He married a local lady also. So they had about 6 children, but alhamdulillah, one of them survived and is still a Muslim. But the rest, probably they've taken a different route. And also have Sheikh Hassan Mabawa, originally from Mozambique, but he's a Tanzanian who settled in Mozambique and came to South Africa as well. And he was from the scholarly family as well. He was a sheikh. They were given the title Papelo because they used to make tawiz at that time in Mozambique. So they were given the title of Papelo because they would cure using tawiz, writing on a paper. And their surname basically was Mabama Hamad Sahal, who traced their roots right through up to Maghreb in Morocco. We also have Mr. Abdullah Hassan I spoke about, who was amongst the Zanzibaris who never settled in Chatsworth. Basically, the first, I think, Zanzibaris, they were moved in a different area in Durban across the sea, and then from there they went to Unit 2, but some of them never settled there. They spread across the country, in Newcastle, you found, but Mr. Abdullah Hassan specifically went to Johannesburg to work in the mine. From Johannesburg was moved in Soweto, married a local lady, they had children. This is how Islam basically came. And there are many individuals like this were immigrants who came and settled there and started spreading Islam. Some of them we only realized later, when we were born, we find a copy of the Quran, we realized that this man was a Muslim. And this thing. But because whatever, maybe they failed to convert their wives or spouses, but he was a Muslim. So this is how Islam started in Soweto. As it continues, we started seeing more locals now coming in. You look at Dr. Gulam Muwatse, who studied As-Salam under Sheikh Ahmed Tidat, also as well, he embraced Islam in the early 60s. The most famous one, Said Ali Zange, which a lot of people, by the way, confuse him as being amongst the first Muslims in Soweto. I heard in one of the interviews in Salam Media, I think was it last year, where they referred to him as the first Muslim family in Soweto, but that was just miscorrection because he embraced Islam later in the 70s. And we know that Islam was there in Soweto before even the township. As soon as the township was established, we had it. I mean, the lady, Muhammad, I interviewed is almost the same age with Said Ali, and she was born within the Muslim community. So it shows that he was not the first. But what he did, he was among the important drivers who built Islam in Soweto, established a mosque, formed an organization, became very active, and so a lot of people knew him, and they mistaken him to be amongst the first Muslim of Soweto, but it isn't the case. In the Eastern Cape as well, we managed to track down Mr. Luwata. It would seem as if he was a contemporary of Imam Shamil Kula, because he was based in Langa, Imam Dawood Lobi, but he moved back to Western Cape, buried as a non-Muslim. These are the first Muslim, but also we find in Kwanubush also there were early Muslims around about the 70s that were there. Right. In trying, to build, to establish, to maintain and develop Islam in these particular areas, we find that the Muslims in the township and rural areas, they've created many institutions and organizations to try and make sure that Islam continues in this area. And we find that the first one, Tate Kulami, he had a Dobsonville Muslim Association in the late 60s in Soweto. Also, we were talking of about 200 families that were there who were Muslims and that he groomed and this thing. We also have a Soweto Muslim Association in the 70s. We have the South African Islamic Council in the early 80s, which was formed by the black Muslims in Gauteng. It included areas like Pretoria, Mamelodi, Thembisa, Soweto. But it never took place really, it didn't stay long, because immediately after that time we found the formulation of the Murabitun movement. Even though it was more of a tariqah, but it had some kind of a leadership aspect to it, you know, the Amir, the Wazir, and so it was more like an organization, like a movement as well. That's it. We have also the shura structures in the post-apartheid that we have. The Islamic Township basically in the post-apartheid era is that it's more complex than it was in the early days. We have various, like any other Muslim community, or Sufi, or Tablighi, which really I think makes Islam a little bit more complicated, because I feel that it was too early for such communities to be so divided along the strands. You know, if you look up to today, the South African Muslim community, they're still just between Utopandi and Tablighi, which is this thing. Factors that are affecting the growth of Islam, number one is consistency. When I speak about this, those communities that I spoke about, many of them have dissolved. Like for instance, if I say in Yanga East, it was a buzzing Islamic listing. So it's not there now. In Langa Township, there was a big Muslim community, it's not there. In Dobsonville, I'm speaking of huge Muslim community, it's not there. So these things are affecting the growth of Islam basically in the township. The second is issues of marriage. You know, we find that many sisters, when they divorce, they leave Islam. That's another problem. The third, the offspring. We had a big meeting to discuss this issue, and we found out that that's a real thing that is happening, where the children who grow up from these Muslim families, they don't continue with Islam. Yes, we know that in normal community we have these challenges, but for our purposes, it seems as if it's big, it's extraordinarily huge, where we find many young people who grew up in these Muslim families, they end up being Muslim. So these are some of the issues that affect the growth of Islam. The internal conflicts that we have within the community as well. The environment, you know, you're operating basically in a Christian environment in a township, which makes it very difficult. Really, your friends, your family, your school, halal food, and all those things, it seems to swallow you up, you know, and move you up. But in conclusion, despite all these challenges, alhamdulillah, the Muslim community of South Africa has created very good Muslim individuals that really are very capable of taking Islam forward. And this is what we need to start seeing and working in building Islam. Shukran, jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, second speaker is Mr.Thembisa Fakude, and maybe some points about him. Okay, he's a director and senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogue. It's called AfroSec. He did his MA at WITS. He's a columnist for the Middle East Monitor. He's a research fellow at Istanbul's Shaykh Forum. He served on the boards of Common Action Forum and also the Mail and Guardian. He's the chair of the Gauteng Industrial Development Zone, the deputy chairman of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, and he was the bureau chief of Al Jazeera. He was media monitor, so he's been involved with Al Jazeera as well. So I would like to call upon Brother Thembisa Fakude.
First of all, let me thank the organizers for the privilege of being invited to this august and very important conference. My task is a bit difficult because the topic I want to tackle has not been discussed much. So there's a little bit on the pool of references from which I could draw. One. Two is I also didn't have enough time to interview people due to time limitations and resources, but I'm encouraged that some of my colleagues are intending to further expand on this subject, which I think is very important. And the subject I will be talking to is called towards understanding the emerging Afro Muslim culture, which is something really fascinating that I've been observing over the past couple of years. Young people particularly from the townships, creating and crafting their own culture and redefining who they are. And this for me, has been very, very interesting. So over the years we've had challenges, and I think what Sheikh Zaid has done was important because it kind of seeks to introduce the current status quo within Muslims in the township in particular, but there's also a discussion and this proliferation and the making of it identity within the Muslim societies in South Africa. It's unfortunate, of course, that this identity which has been forged is in response or in protest of intra-contradictions and discrimination tendencies within the Muslim communities. And as a result, because of the over-politicization of a South African society, you have Muslims, black Muslims, who are also part of this over-politicized society, who are now saying we are facing similar challenges within the so-called embraced community of Muslims. And as a result, we're going to rebel and we're going to revolt against it. So there is now a situation where young Muslims in particular are now beginning to say, let us redefine who we are. And most of these Muslims were products or are products of the madrasa system, which has been by and large dominated by established Muslim, and in this case, when I mean by established Muslim, I'm referring to both Malay and Indian Muslims. And that is the protest or the rejection that we see happening. So they are redefining themselves in terms of art, for example, in terms of how they dress, for example, the color which is infusing both Oriental fashion styles and African style. Ordinarily, in any part of the world, this would be an expected progression of culture. But in South Africa, there's another unique element to it, which is not only about merging and this proliferation and progression of culture, but there's also an element of rejection of the established culture. So whereas you'll find that people from the East African part and the Horn embraced, the Bantu's cultures and the Arab or Muslim culture, and it created this harmonious existence and culture. In South Africa, there's that part, yes, but there's also a culture of rebellion. There's also the culture of saying, we are not of them. And that's very interesting. And it's articulated in the form, for example, there's a new phenomenon of nasheed. In the Arabic, nasheed will be this form of art and singing, and we call it the a cappella. Now you have Muslims who are having their own Islamically inspired a cappella, for example, in the townships of South Africa. They look different, and I've got some examples. Even the masajids, which, by the way, there is a proliferation of, as the black middle class continues to grow. We have black Muslims who are now sponsoring and constructing their own masajids. I did try to explain what the Afro Muslim culture is, but I'll go through it quickly before I show you the pictures of what I actually meant. It is a culture making, by the way, which is influenced by young black people and their daily experiences with the broader South African multicultural society. As I've said, it is a resistance and a rejection of an established Muslim identity in favor of a new culture reflective of black South African culture and identity. It is a realization that black people within South Africa are a majority within a minority. And this is something that most of us have struggled with over time. Suddenly you think that as a Zulu, you are a minority in your own country. And it's not the case. We are a majority within a minority culture, and that will, I think, continue to inform the political interaction moving forward. And these are the youngsters who are emphasizing that point, that remember that you are a Xhosa or a Zulu or a Muswati within a minority setup. And that, to an extent, for me, it's resurrection, a black conscious type of a reaction to the current challenges that we're facing. And these, as I've said, it's by and large consisting of a second generation Muslims. In other words, my kids and Zaid's kids and all other Muslims who reverted to Islam. And these are all kids who we send to the madrasas and private schooling, and their experiences within those platforms have not, unfortunately, been that positive, and as a result, they come back home and they insist that we are going to carve our own. Luckily, not contrary, but against the backdrop of what Zaid has presented in terms of most Muslims, whenever they divorce or change localities, they leave Islam, we find that our kids are much more proud of being Muslims. So instead of them saying we are retaliating and going against this religion which you've imposed on me, they're saying it is our religion. However, we are going to add a bit of flavor into it. One, two, it is our religion. However, we're going to begin to infuse different political understanding. And it's also our religion, but at the same time, we're not going to look like those people who are continually perceived to be oppressors and who are racist against us. So that's the positivity that we see. We're seeing a parallelism of young people who are saying, we are going to continue with our religion, but having said that, we're also going to impose our own identity and political understanding of what the religion is. These are the reasons I'm talking about, of why there is the emergence of the rise of Afro Muslim culture. As I've said, the continuation of tensions between black and established Muslim communities has impacted on that. Black cultural dislocations and misunderstandings by established Muslims. Again, it was also pushing that, but I'm also glad that there is not total rejection of Islam, which we've seen happening in other parts of the country and indeed the world, where people feel disgruntled by certain issues or factors within Islam, and as a result they decide to leave Islam. We don't see that. I was also happy to be part and parcel under the leadership of Shaykh Zaid Langa in the organization of South African Black Muslim Conference, which is a very important platform. Again, it's also inspired by the need to redefine and recommunicate who black Muslims are, because there is a misunderstanding, one, but importantly, there is a lack of a platform where black people can go and get to understand their agencies Islamically. Let me just try and explain. By the way, I think in Zulu and translate in English, so pardon my complicated, hyper English at some point. What the South African Black Muslim Conference is trying to do is, an example, we accept Lobola. Lobola is part of an African culture, and as a result, most of us being rivets to Islam doesn't mean that we have to throw the baby with its bathwater. Now, the complication is, where do you locate that within the Islamic understanding? So we will take the dowry, but at the same time we'll take Lobola. One. Two, uncles are the main drivers of this culture, and they are part and parcel of this Lobola culture. And one of the essential feature within the Lobola is the whiskey that must be given to the uncle. And so where do you locate yourself as a Muslim in that particular situation? The other situation that we find ourselves is being rivets and coming from homes that are shebeens in quite many instances. You will share your fridge with your mum who supports you and who sells alcohol and pork. So your food will be coming from the same fridge. Now, how do you, again, as a young Muslim who is reverted to Islam, are you going to reject and burn your mom's house and have no place to sleep? Or you're going to find some kind of commonalities in terms of how do you live with this reality? And I think that's where the relevance of South African Black Muslim Conference is. The challenge, of course, is that we need to start populating it with the ulama who will continually engage with these discussions so that they can come up with solutions, because these are not going anywhere. They are there to stay, as long as we're going to have people reverting into Islam. So that's the other reason why you have this emergence of Afro Muslim culture and platforms and institutions such as the South African Black Muslim Conference, notwithstanding the attention and criticism that some people leveled against the emergence of this movement, and people like Zaid and myself and others tried very hard to insist that it's not racist, but for the lack of a better term, we have to call it what it is. It's black, and I think people were, challenged by the word black. But that word black didn't or does not mean racism. But at the same time, I don't feel the urgency of continually explaining myself in that regard. These are the few traits of what it means to be this Afro-Muslim culture I'm talking about. Again, it's a work in progress, so you will have to pardon me. On how it looks like. It's inspired, as I've said, the a cappellas of African Nasheed type of singing. We have a lot of these choirs and groups now that are here. The fashion is changing, decoration of the masjids, as I've said, are also changing. And there's also, by the way, the reversion or going back into using the indigenous names. Like I call myself Thembisa proudly so, because that's my Muslim name. And when I became Muslim, I embraced an Arab name, which is Ibrahim. So it doesn't mean or did not mean that because I'm Thembisa, I'm not a Muslim. Muslim is Thembisa, Ibrahim is the Arabic name. By the way, he's Jewish. He was not Arabic at some point. So those are the kind of things. So this is the look of this new Afro-Muslim culture. These are the Muslims, that's how they look like. They'll be having a hijab, but they'll put some African culture. There's another one there. And this is how they look like. It's a Muslim scarf, and it's got this infusion of African look. Sorry, I didn't get permission to these people. I was telling Professor Ngubane that I'm sorry, that's not Professor Ngubane, but I was saying I wanted to use her, but I didn't get permission. This is the mosque, for example, in Winterfeld. That's how the masjid looked like. We've got all of these colorful things. And that's the mimbar that you can see. It's got all of nice, that's the mosque. I didn't get a fuller picture, but that's me and my other brothers. The other one passed on, Allah accept him, inshallah. But this is how this is the new look. So all Africans who are now looking at building the masajids or whatever else they look at, they embrace this type of fashion and look. So in conclusion, quickly, is that the racial polarization of the Muslim community in South Africa possesses a new threat in terms of Muslim cohesion, unfortunately. Because it's angry and it's protest, you are likely to have this division. And this division is also likely to invite unnecessary people with other intentions in terms of Muslim unity. So that's something that we need to look at. Furthermore, and importantly, though this process of rejection discovered redefinition of black Muslim youth, finding answers to them in the absence of the intervention of the ulama is also dangerous, because they're creating themselves and there's no ulama assisting, which is key. So they are defining this culture in the absence of guidance, which I think is very important. Finally, throughout the world, Islam has metamorphosized in different ways. It has gone, this homegrown culture, etc. My only concern in South Africa is that it's angry, it's in protest, and for me that's a challenge, and I think it's something we need to look at. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.
The issue of identity, there's always been debate. Are you Muslim first or South African first? There's always been. Are you South African first or Muslim first? Throughout the world, people have multiple identities. You're not just South African, you're not just Muslim, you're not just Zulu, you're not just Afrikaans speaking, you're all of it. But of course, the most important thing for a Muslim is that Muslim identity must be the predominant. The rest is secondary. Okay, I think that's very important. The other point I just want to make is that Muslims in the dominant communities, whether it's Indian or Malay, have very little idea of how Muslims in the townships live. And so we have to say, Jazakumullah, commend them to bring it to our attention. And once I gave a talk at the mosque in Durban on this, what little I knew about what happens in the township, it was not very well received, I can tell you. They don't want to hear. Why? I don't know. So I think it's very important for us to be aware of what they go through in the township. It's nothing like the challenges that Asian Muslims face. I think that's very important to know that. Also, I think the word black means always been contested. Should we say black? Should we say African? And so on. This reminds me of black consciousness. You know, Steve Biko. And what he basically said, it's got nothing to do with racism. It's to do with identity. It's to do with regaining integrity and pride. It's got nothing to do. So you had actually Indians in the black consciousness movement, like Sri Murli and Seth Cooper and so on. So even whites were not excluded. So the term black was more political, had to do with identity and so on. So I don't think there's any problem in using this term. Maybe last point is, you see, we like the Darul Ulooms. I'm not going to be critical about it. I mean, there are lots of issues. But I don't know, maybe in present, some of them will know what's happening. But in the past, the Darul Ulooms that were established in Transvaal and Natal were replicas of the Darul Ulooms in India. Okay? That's exactly because many of the ulama trained over there, so they use the same syllabus, the same curriculum, they use Urdu as the medium of instruction and so on. I'm not sure how much has changed. So even with the Muslims, even ordinary people, they identified, maybe not the younger generation, with India or Pakistan, and they dressed in that way. So there was no indigenous, dressing that developed. So they would wear what people in Arabia wear, or what people in India and Pakistan wear. So I'm glad to see that in the black Muslim community, we are emerging with a very specific South African identity. I think that's missing. Okay, so with these words, I need to introduce then our third speaker, that is Sindile Amina Ngubane. When she saw me, she gave me a big smile. I'm not quite sure why. Okay, she is at UNISA. She's a professor and head of the institute. So they have students from all over the world. It's all done, of course, online. And she's also president of Distance Education Associations of Southern Africa. She is the leader of the scientific committee of the South African chapter of the Muassasa Foundation. She's also done disability studies. She's in charge of the disability studies for the African Union. She's a visiting scholar. She was at the Open University in the UK and as well at Cambridge University. She's principal investigator of the NR-funded community engagement that's focused on gender-based violence on women with disabilities. And the focus now on research is on black Muslim livelihood and empowerment and sustainability. This is a very, very important issue right now, and I think it actually blends in with the whole development of the identity of black Muslim, but at the same time looking at a particular socio-economic condition. So, Professor Ngubane.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I will repeat, if your energy is not here, I'm not here. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Shukran jazilan. I'm going to look at the African Muslims. I said African because when I say black, then some people become uncomfortable. But the reality is that I really look at black Muslims' presence in religious and educational matters in South Africa. This is a paper that's about 19 pages. So it means trying to compress it into a PowerPoint was very, very difficult. I've sent the paper for critical reading, and I'm hoping that it's going to get published. The reason for me to do this was because the history of Islam in the sub-Saharan Africa mainly comes from the works of Arab geographers and historians such as Al-Bakr, Al-Zuhri, Ibn Battuta, and others, and then the historical research of important trade centers such as the Sudanese cities. So when you you do literature review, you find that there is very little that is actually from black scholars, and specifically from South Africa. So when I was doing this, you'll understand as I go on, of course it was a qualitative approach, and I had to look at ethnography, to use ethnography as my approach, which allowed me to do an analysis of historical and current perspectives on the influence of Muslim women. And this paper actually is based on appreciative inquiry. Whenever we do research, we tend to look at challenges, we look at problems, and I think that as a Muslim scholar, Allah says that if you are not grateful, I will not give you more. So as Black Muslims, I felt that we need to look at our history in an appreciative way, to say, you know, how far have we, do we come from, and what have we achieved, instead of what is it that we don't have. And I believe, inshallah, that is going to lead us to actually see more positive things in terms of who we are. So, again, ethnography is basically a dialogue of reflection. You're thinking critically about who you are, and with me, I was not thinking about who I am in terms of just myself, but who we are as a Black South African community. The voices are clearly expressed, and an individual history has disjunctive framework in their mind that causes new insights. So I was not just looking back for the sake of doing it, but I'm thinking, how do we actually move forward? Because when you do futuristic studies, you need to make sure that you are coming up with something new. So the main purpose was to explore, to stimulate, to provoke, to reformulate the existing beliefs about Muslim women's influence in society through appreciative inquiry. Muslim women, like my brother mentioned, and I think both of them have mentioned that, we've always been almost like just a second thought. And I will not blame anybody for that, I'll blame us. Because when Allah says that, in terms of being a believer, you are all accountable for your own actions. So there is no way that we'll keep on blaming our husbands for divorcing us and then we leave Islam. When you come into Islam, it needs to be a personal responsibility to make sure that you maintain your own belief, you understand your religion. The ethnography was used to show how a Muslimah from South Africa used her Islamic belief to make positive contributions to the spiritual and educational growth of a community. Why did I then zoom into one person? Because we are Africans and we believe in stories. Now I had to go back and say, who do you know that is a Muslimah that has made a contribution? And I'm glad that my brother Thembisa has shown you the masjid of Ngangi, which is in Winterveld in Pretoria, which actually, this Muslimah that I talk about is actually the mother of I would say the founder of that particular place, because through her talking and her reflections with her son and her family, it was then, they were able then to make sure that at the end that masjid is built. So it's not just a masjid, it's not just Ngangi Masjid, but it's the brainchild of a Muslimah. So this woman that I'm talking about is Mama Ngubane. I will tell you more about her. Now, when you look at the presence in terms of what has happened with the issue of Muslim women in the continent, in Nigeria you see people like Balkisu Yusuf, Aisha Imam, Amina Mama, Sauduta Mahdi, and Adamu has actually written a lot about these women and their contribution to what was happening in their communities. Then again, you come to Kali, who talks about Ali Duyu, describing how African Muslim women would create an alternative vision. So when you are creating an alternative vision, you first check what is happening in your own community. You are not worried about what is happening. As Black African women, yes, we should be appreciating what has happened with the so-called established Muslims who are Indians, yes. But it should not be more about criticizing, but it's about how do we take any examples that we can apply in our society, how do we network with those women, because they also understand the challenges that are involved for Amina by being a woman, and then come and also bring the alternative vision to our own communities. Then we have authors like Nadvi, Vahed, Tayyub, who have also captured the role of women like Fatima Sidat, Feroza Adam, Rahima Musa, Zainab Asfat, Fatima Mir, Amina Kachalia, and Zuleika Mayat. And I'm glad that I've met some of these women when I grew up in Durban. So Prof Dangor is saying, why did I smile when I saw him? Because when I went to university as a child, I met him there. And I knew it. But Ahmad Said Mullah knows how I came in. I'm a product of Awqaf. You see? So I came in when I came for interview, and they said, what is it that you see in the future? And I said, inshallah, I want to be a professor. And I didn't have the funds. And it is through the generosity, alhamdulillah, of other people. And again, alhamdulillah, I'm a product of the Islamic University in Uganda, which is under the OIC. So what I'm saying is that we've grown up interacting with Auntie Zuleika Mayat and the role that she actually played in our life. Then the question was then, what have we done in our community? Because for you to be proud of your identity, you need to have a person that is like you, that you can actually try to assimilate. So therefore, this paper tries to add to the history of Muslim women, highlighting the role of Mama Zainab Ngubane, may Allah be pleased with her. So the Mama Zainab is from Louis Richard. She was actually a Christian, and she was a nurse by profession. And when she moved into Mabopane, which was then Bophuthatswana, she couldn't get a job because of hijab. You couldn't get into a hospital and be a nurse who's covered. And she said, even if I'm a qualified nurse, I'm going to leave looking for a job so that I can serve Allah. Because you have to choose between whether you remove your scarf, if you want to, because people think it's a choice. You choose whether you want to keep your staff and please Allah, or you carry on and leave the job. So she made that choice. Now, I want you to note, when she did that, she actually confirmed one thing, to say that education is not about a qualification, but it's about the skills that you use to actually develop your communities. So what she did was that she saw the high level of illiteracy in her community and the lack of exposure to Islam through the things that were happening. So she started offering extra classes under her tree in her home. And that is why her son, Kulungile Ngubane, said, my mother used to teach under a tree, so I have to make sure that I have a proper structure where people can get education. So then she had the extra classes. She will provide food for the people, for the children that she knew very well were living under very serious poverty, so that when they go home, at least they've eaten. And then they will assist with homework. And also, she took the opportunity. She didn't say, come and I'll give you dawa. No. She was giving them food, she was helping them with homework, and she was teaching them Islam. Subtle approach. And therefore, when you go to Mabopane, you'll find most people, they might have left Islam, but they understand Islam. So they are not hostile towards Muslim because they understand it. Then the values that she promoted is the issue of loving your neighbor, and I think most of us have to remember and learn from that, because in most cases you find that we've closed our walls, we've closed because of course of security, but we do not know whether our neighbor has eaten. So she made sure that the well-being of people, actually she took care of it. And also she tried to teach morals that were there in Islam indirectly to the locals. Then she adopted the gospel methods. Remember, she was a Christian that she had learned from church to actually invite people to Islam. The Ngubane household was the first indigenous Muslim home in the 70s in Winterfeld. She played the mediator role when there were disagreements in the community. I play a role in other interfaith communities, and it's critical that whenever people have conflict, you go there and provide a smile. When we go to the prisons and people are scared of prisoners, of inmates, I say, no, I'm going to teach computer. No, but they're dangerous. I'm like, no, they're not. You are making them dangerous because your approach is that they've done something wrong. So the mediator role as Muslim women is very critical. We have to make sure that we go there and bring that harmony and bring that smile. And people understand that, no, even if there is a problem, calm down, drink your water, let's talk. What is the problem? So she played this particular role in the community. Then again, whenever couples approached her for marital advice, she ensured to preserve the families and encourage them to actually let Allah's presence permeate their homes. This is very critical again because as Muslims in the townships, it's a serious problem. And I think it's not only in the townships, it's everywhere. There's this madness about second wife and third wife and all that, but people cannot even afford it. So it's important that people sit down and, the older couples, the young couples sit down and promote the institution of marriage. There is no way you are going to promote Islam in a community when you do not promote marriage. So this role she played very well. And then she used the Islamic teachings to teach that divorce should be the last resort. So it's about conflict resolution. Then she also led the women-led businesses through stock fairs and all that in order to support communities. And the very important issue, the concept of hudud. Some people will say it's critical, but remember, when a child is raped and we know who raped that child, then hudud should come in. Whether you quote me, whatever, I don't care. When anything goes wrong, you need to attend to that, because if you do not do that, then people think it's normal to go and abuse kids, to abuse women, or whatever it is. So she made sure that there was actually justice. So she played this particular role. Then, let me go to the implications, which is the most important thing, yes. The importance of appreciative model is in order to move beyond qualifications and stature, but to recognize the great work of African Muslim women have to be done to develop their communities religiously and educationally. So it's important that even, just forget about qualifications. Go out there, make your pure intention, and contribute. Then women have published works to support reforming, establishing schools for girls where they can study and opposing and involve in student and national movements. It's important that actually women get involved, and we also publish this. Then state policies should allow groups of women to enter previously male-dominated occupations and professions. Then lastly, I would say that this is very important, because when you look even at the history of Islam, women played a critical role, you know it. So we must make sure that women actually are making sure that we influence the national identity of peace and making sure that we grow. So at the end, I will say that when we say that heaven or Jannah is in the feet of the mother, it's not just about that. It's about the work that we do in all our communities, infiltrating and understanding who we are, so that at the end, when people look at you, they are not thinking that you are converting them, but they take the pure Islamic values that you are trying to give to them. I thank you.
Okay, some important points. One is, of course, you're talking about marginalizing of women in African or black societies. You're not alone, eh? It's the same in the majority Asian Muslim communities. Women are marginalized to a great extent. We're still debating whether women can attend prayers in the masjid, still now, after 100 years. Okay. Uh, the other, yes, very important point is that when we give dawah, you're inviting people to Islam. Now, whether they accept or not is not your business. You invite them to Islam, but the point you raise is very important, that even if they don't accept Islam, if they become friendly, Islam friendly, in other words, you're creating an environment where the people are not hostile. That's very, very important. So whether they accept or not, that's the first prize. But if they don't, the second prize is to create a non-hostile environment. And we need that right now with Islamophobia all over the world. In South Africa, apparently, it's also beginning to raise its head. And so we need to be very circumspect about how we approach things and so on. You also mentioned, you want to chop hands and chop heads and so on. I think very soon you're going to be getting a few, descriptions like fundamentalist and so on. And they might link you with ISIS. So just be very careful, Professor Ngubane. All right, so I think you've raised some very, very important issues. There were some also issues which, I can't remember what you actually said, but I think it had to do with bid'ah. So I think you're going to be in a firing line, but inshallah, you're going to survive. Okay, our last speaker is, if I can pronounce the name properly, Esgi Guna. Is it? Esgai, is it Guna? Okay. All right, she's a fellow in contemporary Muslim society in a globalized world at the Al-Walid Center, University of Edinburgh. She has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Illinois. She's a visiting fellow at Harvard University, a fellow at the Center for South Asian European Studies at the University of Grad. She taught critical race theory in the Department of Sociology at University, I can't pronounce the name, so I'm not going to attempt, and also at the Istanbul Association for Migration Research. At the Al-Walid Center, she conducts postdoctoral research on Ottoman legacy in Cape Town. Yeah, so that's I'm sure the Cape Townians are going to be very happy with you. And also a teacher's course on Muslim Africa in global perspective. So over to you.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers. There's no time to name you all, but you know who you are. And I'm also very happy to have landed on this panel. It's a subject that is dear to my heart and central to my research. So I have many questions for you later. And in this presentation, I discuss the constructions of Islamic heritage in Cape Town through the study of two cases: the IRCICA Awqaf Museum and the Cape Muslim Slave Heritage Museum, situated within the Castle of Good Hope. I study comparatively the history and historiographic narrative of the two museums, the sites on which they were built, and the symbolic and political meanings of this choice, their institutional relations and curatorial practices, as well as the processes of collecting and exhibiting material culture. All in all, this presentation aims to explore what decolonization means for both museums and the different tools with which they seek to decolonize museum practice. Genealogical arguments are central to the construction of Islamic heritage for both of the museums. There is, however, a fundamental difference between how they trace and emphasize genealogies of Cape Muslim communities. Where the museum and the Castle of Good Hope reclaims and celebrates the slave heritage of the Muslim communities, the Awqaf Museum today emphasizes the Ottoman lineage of the community leaders by remembering and honoring the legacy of two scholars, Abu Bakr Effendi and Mahmud Fakih Emin Effendi, who were appointed by Ottoman authorities. In this presentation, I analyze how these two different modes of remembering history and constructing Islamic heritage through genealogy reflect different understandings of decolonizing museums. Under apartheid, museums focused on settler history, marginalizing and denying the cultural heritage of non-white communities. This has begun to change with the democratization in the 1990s, when the history and heritage of diverse communities found a new home in South African museums, and the commemoration of the victims of racism, slavery, and apartheid became possible. Museums became key institutions of nation building. The history of Bokap Museum illustrates these institutional transformations on a national scale. The Bokap Museum was originally a product of the apartheid's racialized cultural policies and had an exceptional and unique position within the heritage landscape of apartheid South Africa. It was Isaac David du Plessis, an Afrikaner scholar at the University of Cape Town and the Commissioner of Colored Affairs, who proposed as early as 1943 to establish a Malay museum as part of the preservation of the Malay Quarter. As a result of du Plessis' lobbying, Bokap was declared a group area for Malays in 1952, and the Bokap Museum was established in 1978 to represent the Malay culture as a homogeneous and distinct entity that was separated from diverse other communities with clearly defined boundaries. Since the 18th century, the colonial gaze has constructed the Muslims in South Africa as exotic others, especially through the representation of Cape Malays in travel writing, cartoons, paintings, and caricatures. The early exhibitions at the museum therefore reflected this orientalizing gaze, and here you see the cultural artifacts representing the social life in the Malay Quarter, and the infamous bridal room on the right, which depicts the customs and traditions of the Cape Malay. Leslie Witz notes that the Muslim weddings, dress, and spiritual practice displayed in the Bokap Museum in 2007 continued to reinforce the stereotype of Malay culture defined by du Plessis in the 1930s and 1940s. However, structural changes were in place in the Bokap Museum since the early 2000s. IRCICA developed a framework for collaborating with the communities that experts previously represented and objectified in museums. Integrating communities in the curatorial processes and diversifying collections with community donations marked the beginnings of transformation in Bokap and other museums. In Henning's words, museums have gradually moved from being spaces of colonial curiosity to that of community engagement. It was within this national and institutional context that the Efendi Room exhibition was curated under the supervision of Dr. Halim Gençoğlu in the Bokap Museum in the late 2010s. When entering the Bokap Museum, the visitors find on their left a room dedicated to the Efendi family. This exhibition makes at least 3 critical interventions into the historical and cultural narrative of the museum. First, there has been a general consensus that the museum building was once the house of Abu Bakr Effendi, an Islamic scholar who was appointed to Cape Town by the Ottoman Sultan in 1862, upon the request of Queen Victoria, to settle the disputes within the Muslim community. The new exhibition proves this long-held belief as false by showing that the house instead belonged to Mahmud Fakih Effendi, another Islamic scholar, whom Dr. Gençoğlu calls the Forgotten Effendi. This historical correction comes with consequences for museum practice and constitutes the second critical intervention I will discuss. By situating the museum as the house of a Muslim family who was evicted in the 1970s, the exhibition carves a space for community engagement. Dr. Gençoğlu, a historian at the University of Cape Town, collaborated with Nathri Effendi, the great-grandchild of Mahmud Fakih Effendi, to reach out to IRCICA and integrate this family history within the museum space, their lost home. The exhibition includes photographs and objects from the family archive, as you can see here, which are aligned as museum practices with the democratization and nation building in post-apartheid South Africa. Some of the objects exhibited in the Effendi room are coffee grinder with the Sultan's signature, Iznik coffee cups, clay pot, oil lamp, candle holder, rosewood tesbih, red fez, of course, artwork sent to Mahmud Faki Effendi by Ottoman Caliphate, along with medals for education services and for his contribution to the Hejaz Railway project, as well as the photograph of the Imperial Ottoman School run by Mahmud Faki Effendi. The emphasis on the Ottomanness of the objects used in the daily life of the family, who once owned the building that is now hosting the Bokap Museum, brings me to my third and final point, that is the emphasis of Ottoman genealogy in the construction of Islamic heritage in the Cape. By creating a space for the family history within the museum in collaboration with Natri Effendi, Dr. Gençoğlu's research brings the Ottoman legacy to the forefront of Islamic heritage construction in Bokap. And this is done less through an emphasis of South Africa's diplomatic relations with the Ottomans under British colonialism, but through genealogical claims. The Islamic connections to the Ottoman Caliphate therefore become less of an inter-imperial arrangement, but of blood ties. This reconfiguration of Muslim genealogies and rewriting of Islamic history results in the abundance of the symbols and signatures of Ottoman imperial past in the museum space, as well as the Turkish national ones as illustrated by the flag in this picture. Wherever the picture is, thank you. Within the confines of the Effendi room, the exotic images of the Cape Malay that previously dominated the Bokap Museum are therefore replaced with the images of the Ottoman political and spiritual authority and transnational religious connections to contemporary Turkey. The implications of all this for the project of decolonizing museums was something we discussed with Dr. Gençoğlu during our interview in his office in April 2022, which tells you how recent this research is. For him, as for many other scholars of Islam in Africa, decolonization meant engaging with alternative archives to the colonial archive. In this case, it was the Ottoman archive which enabled the decolonization of the historical narrative in the museum. There are significant differences between the Bokap Museum and the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum. First of all, the Bokap Museum is an IRCICA museum, which is classified as a public museum, whereas the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum is a private museum established by a community member. The latter does not have a colonial or apartheid legacy in the way that the Bokap Museum does, or is trying to unleash itself from since the end of the apartheid. To the contrary, the museum is structured from the perspective of the enslaved and colonized from the very beginning to counter the dominant historical and cultural narrative which has historically privileged and celebrated the white settler heritage. The second important difference concerns the site and location of the two museums. While the Bokap Museum is located in the house of a Muslim family who were forcibly removed, the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum is situated within the Castle of Good Hope, the historical monument of military conquest, colonial domination, and racial oppression, located at the heart of the city. If the Effendi Room seeks to decolonize the Bokap Museum by reincorporating the evicted family's history into their lost home, which is now converted into a museum, the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum reclaims the iconic fort to commemorate and memorialize the slave past, which is in itself a decolonizing project from the beginning. Thirdly, the Bokap Museum combines the IRCICA collection, which relies on practices of collecting and classification embedded in colonial and apartheid history, with family archives and community donations, creating an eclectic structure. In contrast, the collection of the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum belongs for the most part to its founder, Ikshan Higgins, who have been collecting paintings and cultural artifacts that represent the history and social life of South African Muslims for the past 25 years. There is a major commonality between the two museums, however, and it is the centrality of the genealogical arguments to the construction of Islamic heritage. These are, however, very different genealogies. The Effendi Room emphasizes the Ottoman lineage of the family who once owned the building of the museum, as I discussed previously, while the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum emphasizes the slave past in constructing the genealogy of Cape Muslims, as its name makes explicit. When Mr. Higgins first exhibited his collection on Wales Street in Bokap 3 years ago, it was called the Cape Malay Art Exhibition. When the exhibition moved to the Castle of Good Hope, it was the name Cape Malay has shifted to Cape Muslim, which is more inclusive and challenges the legacy of Duplessis' ethnographic taxonomies. Furthermore, slave heritage is now added to the name of the museum, which expands the focus from the Muslim minority to the South African majority implicated in the history of slavery. Quote, during most of the 20th century, Nigel Warden wrote, public awareness of slave heritage was well buried, but the ending of apartheid provided a new impetus to acknowledge and memorialize the slave past, end quote. Public monuments, museums, and commemorations of the slave past has recently turned slavery into an important component of heritage in South Africa. The Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum reflects this social transformation. Everywhere the victor writes history, told me Mr. Higgins during our interview at the museum. And in the Castle of Good Hope, it has historically and literally been the victor who wrote the history. Demilitarizing and decolonizing the historical narrative in the compounds of the fort therefore means rewriting the history from the perspective of the victim, i.e. the enslaved and colonized, as the Cape Muslim and Slave Heritage Museum seeks to do. To conclude, both museums aim to rewrite history against the victor or the curatorial expert by bringing in the views and voices from the community. However, the communities they imagine, that is the Muslims of Bokap or the Cape, differ by ancestral lineage. Whereas the Effendi Room in the Bokap Museum emphasizes the Ottoman descent of the evicted family, the museum in the Castle of Good Hope reclaims the slave past as genealogical heritage. These two divergent constructions of Islamic heritage reflect two different modes of decolonizing museums. The first one juxtaposes the Ottoman archive along with the family archive against the colonial archive as a decolonizing strategy. The second one rewrites history from the perspective of the victim in opposition to the history told by the victor within the fort built by the victor. As a result, one promises dignity to its local visitors by promising an alternative post-imperial identity, which only few can lay claim, and the other does so by inviting its audience to embrace the slave past while honoring and celebrating the hardship and heritage of its victimized ancestors. Thank you.
Also, the issue of identity you brought up, yes, the whole discussion between whether Cape people should be called Malay or Muslim. Now, they used to be called Malay, and some of them are still called Malay, but it was pointed out that lots of people also came from the Indian subcontinent, and therefore the community, the Cape, is quite mixed, of mixed heritage. And so, especially the younger people, the students and so on, rejected the term Malay because they thought this falls within the racist, ideology of government, and so they preferred to use the word Cape Muslim. So then, of course, the third point is about the link with the Ottomans. Again, very important. People just knew about Abu Bakr Effendi. I also heard about Abu Bakr Effendi and the little role he played. But now, with the relationship with Turkey, there's more and more studies being done about the influence of the Ottomans at the Cape. So I think these are very important issues brought up. Thank you very much. So I must say Jazakumullah to all the speakers. I think it's been very, very informative, very, very relevant, very, very thought-provoking. And I wish you well further in your occupations and your studies, inshallah. So Jazakumullah to all of you, and also for keeping time. So from me, the end of the first panel, I say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.